you, Tamsin. Good morning, everyone. Let's spend a few minutes talking about COVID. For you employers out there, I have a feeling you've probably spent a minute or two over the last couple of years dealing with the COVID issues. In the pre-pandemic era, when we used to do these seminars in our offices, I'm sure I'd see a lot of heads nodding up and down right now. So next slide, please. I'm going to spend some time talking about the issue of vaccination in the employment workplace. There's been not legislation, but there's been executive orders and a lot of attention, issuance of orders and courts striking down orders. So here's where we are at now. At the federal level, there's no current vaccine mandate for employers in place except as required by the Center for Medicare Services. So for Medicare and Medicaid affiliated entities, in the healthcare world, there is a vaccination mandate in effect. You may all recall that the Biden administration, by executive order, first OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, had issued an executive order requiring all employers of 100 or more employees to institute a vaccination or test program requirement. That executive order was struck down by a federal court on the basis that OSHA did not have the authority to mandate a vaccination policy, even though OSHA's mandate is to provide for employee safety in the workplace. But a federal court, district court, struck it down, and the Biden administration chose not to take any steps to seek to enforce that. There was also, for the Office of Federal Contracting, there was also a strict, what we call a hard vaccination policy issued by executive order, requiring that all federal employees, all federal contractors, all federal employees have a hard vaccination requirement. That policy was also struck down by a federal court on the grounds that the agency had no authority, no statutory authority to issue such an order. In Massachusetts, we are one of 15 states currently at the state level with a mandatory vaccination requirement for healthcare workers. Next slide, please, Erin. Perspective of the status of the federal vaccination policies, or despite the fact that they're, other than for Medicare and Medicaid affiliated organizations, there are no current federal requirements or mandates for vaccination status of employees. Private employers may implement your own vaccination policy. And here's where I'm particularly seeing a lot of questions from clients, from employers, in the absence of a mandate, of a legal obligation. So this raises a lot of issues. So private employers, you may implement a policy. And we generally refer to these policies in two buckets. The soft policy, which is what the OSHA policy was, provides for either, you may provide for either a vaccination, or for those who don't want to vaccinate or can't for any reason. I'll talk about the exceptions. It's what's called a soft policy. You will allow for testing and masking as a substitute for vaccination. A hard policy is one such as the federal government, federal contractor, or federal employee policy. There's no exception for testing. You either vaccinate or you don't come to work. Out there was a survey published in May of this year, found that reporting that over 40% of employers have one form of vaccine mandate, either a hard or soft policy, even though there's no federal requirement for such. So, and of those employers who have decided to implement a vaccine policy, 45% of those implemented what's called a soft policy. 27% have a hard policy, meaning vaccinate or lose your job, and 28% have a soft policy, but instead of testing and masking while in the workplace, have decided to block unvaccinated employees from working on site. Oh, just for those of you who may be wondering what's corporate America doing, those are the most recent statistics as of May of this year. Next slide, please. So any vaccination policy has to include exceptions for medical conditions and religious beliefs. Unless there's an undue burden, unless the employer can demonstrate there's an undue burden. So if you have a vaccine policy in place or you're considering one, please make sure that you have exceptions for medical condition and religious beliefs, and that's stated, and that you have appropriate forms for employees to make claim to one of the two exceptions. Next slide, please. Talk first about the medical exemption. The medical exemption is allowed for certain recognized contraindications as per the CDC, and there's a link there in our materials to the CDC website. If you look at what the CDC identifies as contraindications, it's really limited to allergic reactions to the vaccine itself, or to demonstrated allergic reactions to previous vaccines, or any component or constituent element of a vaccine. So it's primarily an allergic reaction. In addition to that, anyone who has a history of myocarditis after having received a previous COVID shot or having an allergic reaction to a previous COVID shot will be someone who the CDC would recognize as having qualified for a medical exemption. Next slide, please. Is for a sincerely held religious belief, which is the same standard as under discrimination law. So the employer should assume that if someone's coming forward claiming a religious accommodation request, that they are based on sincerely held religious beliefs. That should be your starting point. Employers are entitled to ask for an explanation of the religious belief and to ask the employee to demonstrate how the religious belief conflicts with vaccination requirements. Employers may choose to ask the employee to claim an exemption in writing, can ask about history with taking other vaccines, can ask for a letter from the employee's clergy. Demonstrating this, I read a report recently on statistical analysis of federal cases that have been brought by employees claiming either the religious or medical exemption, have overwhelmingly resolved so far in favor of the employer. Next slide, please. Here's a list of factors that alone or in combination together may undermine the credibility of a religious belief claim. And I know I'm short on time, so I will move along, but here's 4 aspects or 4 issues that you may want to look at as an employer to get the credibility of a claim for religious exemption. And in both the, next slide, please. So for both the religious and medical exemptions, the employer should consider a reasonable accommodation. You have a duty to, and to assess whether the employee can perform his or her job by remotely, whether reassignment to a different office or location or position, and whether masking and or testing will be a reasonable accommodation under all the circumstances. Next slide, please. And just quickly on this is not specifically a COVID law or regulation, but in the age of the pandemic over the last 2 years, we all know that the burdens of the COVID illness fall not just on those who are COVID positive, but on caregivers, parents, spouses, support networks of people who are COVID negative, but have to give care to people who are suffering from COVID or actively sick with COVID. There's no specific protected status for a caregiver under discrimination laws. That's not a protected status, but be mindful of existing discrimination laws when evaluating requests for caregiver leave, that you don't treat female requests different than male requests. You don't approach a request for caregiver leave differently because there's an assumption that it's going to be the woman's place to stay at home and give the care as opposed to the male's place. So just be mindful of existing discrimination laws, particularly those of gender discrimination, in evaluating requests for leave to provide care.